Hi everybody, this is Gary Waite from Pegasus Battlefield Tours here in the UK, and you're listening to Your Papers Please podcast, the show that brings you some of the lesser known history of World War II. So, welcome to episode 7, where I'm going to continue the incredible story of Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, head of the Alliance resistance network in German-occupied France. Under Marie-Madeleine's phenomenal guidance, Alliance became the largest French intelligence network of the war. In the last episode, we heard about Marie-Madeleine's early life in Shanghai and then in Morocco during her brief pre-war marriage to Edouard Jean Méric, a young French army captain who was posted there. We heard how they separated and Marie-Madeleine returned from Morocco to a society life in Paris, where she met Georges Lustano-Lacoue, codenamed Navarre, a disgruntled French army major who in 1936 engaged her in spy work for him. After the fall of France in 1940, their fledgling resistance network expanded and intelligence work with the British Secret Intelligence Service MI6 began. In late 1940, the network was named Alliance. Gradually, the Vichy and German authorities began to infiltrate and arrest those members of the resistance, until in May 1941, Navarre himself was arrested and had named Marie-Madeleine to take over. The next few months, late summer through autumn and into winter, were a terrible time for Alliance. The network had grown, but so had the ability of the Vichy security police, the dreaded milice, to track down resistance, and eventually even Marie-Madeleine's own mother was arrested. At the end of the previous episode, and after her mother's arrest in December 1941, Marie-Madeleine decides to be smuggled from France into Spain. Stripped to just her underwear inside a diplomatic mail bag on the back seat of a car that has been placed on an open flatbed rail truck to get through the Pyrenees mountains and into Spain, POS 55, as Marie-Madeleine is known by her British code name, can meet her MI6 handler for the first time in Madrid. This brings us to episode 2. It is dark and well below freezing with 10-foot snowdrifts as the train pulls out of the station to begin the journey through the mountains. Marie-Madeleine is in the fetal position, with her legs tucked up and her chin pressed hard into her chest inside the bag. She has already been in this position for at least 3 hours. There is another intelligence officer hiding in the trunk of the car. Jean Boutron, the driver, an Alliance agent who is also the Vichy naval attaché to Madrid, has clambered along the moving train in the dark from the carriage further forward, where he was instructed by railway staff to take a seat during the journey. The journey through the mountains seemed to last an eternity. It was indeed at least 6 hours until eventually, on exiting a tunnel, the bright lights of the border station came into view, where the car was subject to a customs check. Marie-Madeleine could see the torchlights flashing inside the car and hear Jean Boutron explaining who he was and how much of a hurry he was in. Thankfully, the border guards were happy to let him pass, and he drove quickly downhill into the Spanish countryside until he could safely pull over and release Marie-Madeleine from her mailbag. Barely able to move, she briefly passed out and was only brought round by a slug of cognac and a cigarette. She had been inside that mailbag for about 10 hours. Once in Madrid, Marie-Madeleine had a week to recover before a Major Richards of MI6 arrived from London. When they first met and she presented herself, he thought it was a joke, and that Jean Boutron, who was at her side, was indeed the chief of Alliance. But no, Marie-Madeleine made it quite clear who she was.
By the curious accident of the signals, her name for communication purposes became POS, by which she was affectionately known by most of us who had to deal with her during the war. Her application to details was almost terrifying. And I think she had a most amazing capacity for putting herself in the skin of those who worked under her.
They spent the next few days reorganising how to work after the arrests and collapse of the Alliance headquarters in Pau. Marie-Madeleine explained that she was going to establish the new headquarters in Marseille. Once all the talks were over, Marie-Madeleine and Jean Boutron packed up the Citroën with some new radio sets and a stash of money and headed for the border. As they approached the Pyrenees, Marie-Madeleine had to once again strip to her underwear and squeeze inside the mailbag for the return train journey. This time the trains were on time and the journey much quicker. As soon as they arrived back in France on New Year's Eve, Marie-Madeleine was told her mother had been released. But that was the only good news. Many more arrests had been made of Alliance agents, and as far north as Paris too. The whole network was in a state of collapse. Marie-Madeleine knew she had to work fast. After allowing some time for some low-key New Year celebrations, with all the goodies she had brought back from Spain for her agents like whiskey, chocolate, coffee and cigarettes, when the sun rose on New Year's Day 1942, Marie-Madeleine faced the stark realisation that she had the Alliance network to save. Jean Boutron.
She was obviously, since the beginning, the center of all our organization, and she was alone to know all the agent names and false names and missions and so on. And she was the only one in the Réseau which was able to do that. Nobody else could do that.
She immediately set about a reorganisation, as had been discussed in Madrid with MI6. Léon Fay, a French Air Force colonel, was made her chief of staff, and they set out to work on a regional network to cover the whole of France.
One day I was going from Pau to Marseille with a friend, and we heard that arriving in Marseille in the station there would be a checkpoint. So we were quite worried. We had to get out of the station with our set, not knowing what to do. And suddenly the friend who was with me saw a beautiful and stout and enormous gendarme, which was a policeman. And the policeman stared to an enormous set and said, "What is that?" And my friend said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I broke my arm, I can't carry it, and Madame who is with me is so tired, and oh, don't bother," said the man, "I will carry your enormous valise." So we went out of the station, and when the checkpoint arrived, they asked the gendarme, "What is that? What is that?" So he said, "But don't worry, it's my stuff."
Over the next few weeks, Marie-Madeleine and Léon Fay travelled extensively throughout the unoccupied zone, recruiting more and more agents. Many were military personnel through their personal contacts. Some were nobility and the social elite from some of France's best-known families, and others were white and blue-collar workers. As winter turned to springtime, the Alliance network had grown impressively. It now covered most corners of France, and particularly the areas of naval significance along the Atlantic coast, reporting on U-boat activity. In 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was at its height. Now based in Marseille in the south of France, Léon Fay, as Chief of Staff, was running the day-to-day business, whilst Marie-Madeleine masterminded the network. It was around about this time in spring of 1942 that problems began to surface for Alliance. The network was getting larger and there were continual arrests. The Vichy government authorities knew there were intelligence leaks, but how to deal with them was tricky. After all, the common enemy here was still Germany, and most of Vichy wanted them gone, but of course they were under the German stick. It's a very complex subject, but basically some of Vichy were happy to allow some intelligence to be relayed to London, as long as they knew what it was. It all became very politically complicated. The arrests continued, and eventually Marie-Madeleine, through the discovery of some important documents after one such arrest, was implicated as a spy and duly summoned to Vichy for interrogation. An escape plan was hatched to get her away as quickly as possible to North Africa, but she refused, saying, "But who will run the network if I am not here?" Everyone around her pleaded with her to go, and MI6 were apparently furious. But Marie-Madeleine, being Marie-Madeleine, decided to face up to Vichy. After all, she was not under arrest. She caught the train from Marseille with her brother-in-law, and it is possibly during this train journey that Marie-Madeleine came up with the idea for different code names for her agents. She was tired of hearing of the trail of arrests and subsequent torture and execution of her people, many of whom had become friends. She came up with the idea for everyone to be called after an animal. She named Léon Fay Eagle. There was Tiger, Wolf, Osprey, Parrot, Mouse, and so on. She became Hérisson, hedgehog in English, with spikes in every direction. Years later, her son Jack actually told me that she had come up with this idea back in the winter while sealed in the mailbag. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's from this time onwards that all Alliance agents were given these animal names. Now, not one agent would know another agent's name. Hopefully this would stop the domino effect of agents being caught. It did, and much to the Germans' annoyance too. They subsequently came up with their own name for the Alliance network, Noah's Ark. Anyway, Marie-Madeleine presented herself to the Vichy authorities and was subjected to some very close examination, where she claimed her innocence and that the Alliance network had indeed been shut down some months ago. She was released, but was now clearly on their radar. Very soon afterwards, Jean Boutron was arrested. Although not given over to the Germans, he was sentenced to 1.5 years in a jail, which actually was a guarded castle in the Alps. He was lucky, but as he was a Vichy official, it would have been extremely embarrassing for the Vichy government to have to admit to the Germans they had spies in their camp. Consequently, it was dealt with very quietly. However, despite these and many other setbacks, Marie-Madeleine continued to expand the network across the entire country and relayed back to London extremely important intelligence. Alliance was now the eyes and ears of France as far as London was concerned. Many of her agents were actually members of other resistance networks at the same time, so the network was in effect even bigger than Marie-Madeleine could ever have imagined. In late October 1942, Marie-Madeleine was alerted by MI6 to a situation regarding General Giraud, a top French general who had escaped from prison in Germany and made his way back to unoccupied France. The Germans were after him and were laying pressure on the Vichy government to find him and re-arrest him. The Americans, who detested General de Gaulle, were after General Giraud to be taken to North Africa to galvanise the Free French forces there in preparation for Operation Torch, the Allied landing in North Africa due to take place the following month in November. Giraud was of a higher rank than de Gaulle. He was anti-Gaullist and definitely anti-German. He seemed the perfect fit in President Roosevelt's eyes, so the Americans approached MI6 to find a way of smuggling him out of France and through the Mediterranean to Gibraltar. This is where Alliance come in. Now, Marie-Madeleine and Alliance had always tried to keep out of politics and dealt solely with intelligence matters, but here they were, the British Secret Intelligence Service, asking Alliance to become involved with an operation they had absolutely no experience of. Eventually, after a lot of toing and froing, on 4th of November, Giraud and a small entourage were taken out to a waiting British submarine off the French Riviera.
We sent a message saying that General Giraud was ready to go to North Africa, and so the British sent us a submarine near Cavalère, and we waited at the night. We had to put the General in a small house near the sea. Then at midnight, a small boat took him off the shore, and the man was on the boat with a lamp, calling the submarine in a code And then the submarine answered, and the thing was quite easy.
They were then successfully delivered to awaiting General Eisenhower on Gibraltar. But there were supposed to be 2 submarines, another one for more of Giraud's officers, but this second submarine did not show up. Alliance now had to hide these men until the second one arrived. And when would that be? This whole episode had caused a great deal of time, effort and stress for Marie-Madeleine, and worse, it had given the Germans the Alliance network scent. This had been a high-profile escape that required huge amounts of radio traffic, which the German wireless detection units had beamed in on, attracting a great deal of unwanted attention. German Abwehr and Gestapo agents flooded into the south of France, and particularly Marseille, looking for the perpetrators. Marie-Madeleine had arrived back to her headquarters in Marseille on the 6th of November, and her nerves were frayed. Reports of agents being followed and arrests were reported to her, and while our radio operator was establishing contact with London, the front door crashed open with shouts of "Police!" Armed French police and German Gestapo agents streamed into the apartment while everyone inside tried desperately to destroy evidence of codes and messaging schedules. The Germans began rifling through the desks and paperwork. Marie-Madeleine had a mouthful of paper, fighting like a tiger, when the French police inspector whispered in her ear that he was a friend, to calm down, but to keep up the pretense. Eventually, Marie-Madeleine and 6 of her fellow agents were arrested by the French and taken to police headquarters in Marseille and locked up. During this time, the Germans ordered the handover of the Alliance networks for interrogation, but the French police inspector Jean Lénard bided his time. This was an incredible few days where Marie-Madeleine, whilst under arrest, managed to convince some of the policemen to join her network and organise their escape. On 10th of November, the Germans wanted the French police to take the prisoners to a prison at Castres, and from there, the Germans would take them directly into Paris, and no doubt Gestapo headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch, and all that would entail. As all this was happening, reports that the Germans were beginning to cross the demarcation line into the unoccupied zone began filtering through. This did it for many of the French policemen, and they immediately set about getting Marie-Madeleine and her fellow agents to safety. So after loading up with money and weapons from the police station, they were driven out into the countryside and into hiding. The following day, the 11th of November 1942, 200,000 German troops crossed the border and occupied the rest of France. Now the Alliance network would have to properly go underground. They could expect no more favours from friendly police inspectors. It was now the Gestapo who would be dealing with the resistance. Marie-Madeleine was furious about the Giraud fiasco and how it had crippled all the good work done during 1942. Thankfully, this was restricted mainly to the Marseille area, and the chief of the Nice sector temporarily took over the running of the network. Marie-Madeleine was now a wanted woman, and the days of being able to move around relatively freely were over. Hiding out in Château Renaud, a small town around 50 miles north of Marseille, Marie-Madeleine and her small group had to wait for new identities and all the associated paperwork. She changed her appearance by cutting and dyeing her hair. Here she met with another MI6 agent, wireless operator Ferdinand Rodriguez, who made radio contact with London, explaining she was safe.
Well, I must say, when I left England, I was horrified at the idea I was going to work under a woman and get orders from a woman. As soon as I started working with her, everything disappeared, and all the same, I was expecting to work with a woman of about middle age, I'd say, but I met that very young-looking woman from France, and I was awfully pleased after I'd met her, and if I had to work again with a woman, I wouldn't mind at all working with Marie-Madeleine, I must say. And there was also that thing which only a woman can have. It's that sixth sense, which is called intuition. And I had the confirmation of that when in 1943 quite a lot of our friends were arrested in Toulouse, and we had just arrived in a new castle with art for the year, and she thought as soon as she had the confirmation that our friends had been arrested, she said, we must leave straight away. And off we went. There was Marie-Madeleine, another young girl from France called Hermine, and myself. And I was quite ready to wait until the next morning, but we had to start off because she wanted so much to leave the place. Although at that time, being a woman, she was awfully tired. We had to leave at about 3 o'clock in the morning and walked for about 5 or 6 miles to the next railway station, carrying our bags and everything. And we caught the first train to get from the south of France to Lyons, a town where we didn't know anybody. But if it hadn't been for Marie-Madeleine, I must say I would have stayed in that castle, and 2 days after I would have been arrested.
After a couple of weeks, they decided to move first into Toulouse and then into the Corrèze region to Ussel, where an airfield had been established by Alliance for RAF Lysander landings. On the night of 25th of November, a Lysander duly arrived with MI6 expecting Marie-Madeleine to escape back to England. But no, she made good on her promise of extricating the 3 French policemen who'd helped her escape.
I succeeded in escaping with French policemen, happily. It was hard for them, poor men, because after that they were in hiding with us. When we escaped all together, we were 6 and 3 policemen. And to thank them, we sent them to Great Britain in one of those small planes called Lysanders. It was the first time they were flying, and the plane was very small, you know. We had piled them up, their feet over their heads. I remember the officers called them the Marx Brothers.
She would remain in France with even more pent-up fury to avenge the Germans for their part in the executions of her fellow agents. Marie-Madeleine remained in the area over Christmas and New Year into 1943, re-establishing the Alliance headquarters with Léon Fay, her trusty chief of staff, and now also her lover. 1 year ago she had been put in command of Alliance with around 100 agents. A year later, Marie-Madeleine Fourcade commanded just over 1,000.
Main fact when you meet Marie-Madeleine first, well, it was in 1942 when France was occupied. It was first of all that faith, that confidence in the final victory of France.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we end part 2. The plot thickens. Plenty more to come in part 3, where we hear what happens during 1943 when Marie-Madeleine is captured for the second time, and 1944 and the part Alliance playing the build-up to D-Day. Yes, thanks for listening to Your Papers Please with me, Gary Waite. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon. Please don't forget to subscribe so that you can be informed of all future releases. You can find me under Pegasus Battlefield Tours on Facebook and Twitter, and the website www.pegasusbattlefieldtours.com. Thanks everyone. Toodle pip.